She sat on the edge of the park bench, her shoulders slumped, and her hands trembling slightly as they rested on her lap. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the trees, but she didn't seem to notice. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, and every now and then, she would quickly wipe her cheeks with the back of her hand. She thought no one noticed her tears. She thought she was invisible, just another face in the crowd. But she was wrong. A few feet away, a man sat on a nearby bench, casually flipping through a newspaper. He wasn't reading it, though. His eyes kept darting toward her, his brow furrowed with concern. He had noticed her the moment he arrived at the park. There was something about the way she carried herself, like the weight of the world was pressing down on her. He didn't know her, didn't even know her name, but he couldn't ignore the sadness radiating from her. The man hesitated. He wasn't the type to intrude on someone else's private moment. He knew how it felt to want to be left alone, to hide your pain from the world. But something about her made him feel like he couldn't just walk away. He folded his newspaper, set it down, and took a deep breath. This wasn't going to be easy, but he had to try. He stood up slowly, brushing off his pants, and walked over to her bench. He didn't sit down right away. Instead, he stood a few steps away, giving her space. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice gentle but firm. "I don't mean to bother you, but, are you okay?" She looked up, startled. Her eyes were red and swollen, and she quickly turned her face away, embarrassed. "I'm fine," she mumbled, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." The man didn't move. He could tell she wasn't fine. He had seen that look before, the kind of look that said someone was drowning and didn't know how to ask for help. "I know we don't know each other," he said, choosing his words carefully, "but sometimes it helps to talk to someone. Even if it's a stranger." She didn't respond right away. She just stared at the ground, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The man waited patiently, giving her time to decide. Finally, she let out a shaky breath and nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. The man sat down on the bench, leaving enough space between them so she wouldn't feel crowded. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant chatter of people walking by. Then, slowly, she began to talk. She told him about her job, how she had been working long hours just to make ends meet. She told him about her family, how they lived far away and she rarely got to see them. She told him about the loneliness that had been creeping into her life, how it felt like no one cared about her anymore. The words poured out of her, one after another, as if she had been holding them in for far too long. The man listened quietly, nodding occasionally to show he was paying attention. He didn't interrupt or offer advice. He just let her talk, knowing that sometimes, all a person needed was someone to listen. When she finally finished, she looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and exhaustion. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping her face again. "I didn't mean to dump all of that on you." The man shook his head. "Don't apologize," he said. "You've been carrying a lot. It's okay to let it out." She gave him a small, grateful smile, the first one he had seen since he sat down. "Thank you," she said. "I don't even know your name." "It doesn't matter," he replied. "What matters is that you're not alone anymore." They sat there for a while longer, talking about small things, the weather, the park, the book she was reading. It wasn't a deep conversation, but it was enough to lift her spirits, even if just a little. By the time they parted ways, she felt a little lighter, a little less alone. As she walked home, she couldn't stop thinking about the stranger who had taken the time to notice her, to care. It was a small act of kindness, but to her, it meant the world. Little did she know, this was just the beginning. The man had noticed her tears, but what he did next would change her life in ways she never could have imagined. The next day, she woke up feeling a little different. The heaviness in her chest hadn't completely disappeared, but it felt lighter, as if a small crack had opened up to let in some light. She thought about the stranger from the park, his kind eyes and calm voice. It was strange how someone she didn't even know could make her feel seen, even for a moment. She wondered if she'd ever see him again, but she quickly pushed the thought aside. Life wasn't a movie, and strangers didn't usually reappear to save the day. Still, the memory of their conversation lingered in her mind as she went about her day. Work was the same as always, long hours, endless tasks, and the constant pressure to meet deadlines. But today, she found herself pausing every now and then to take a deep breath, to remind herself that she wasn't as alone as she felt. That evening, she decided to go back to the park. She wasn't sure why. Maybe she was hoping to see the stranger again, or maybe she just wanted to feel the peace she had felt the day before. She sat on the same bench, this time with a book in her hands. She wasn't really reading it, though. Her eyes kept scanning the park, half expecting to see him walk by. And then, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, she saw him. He was walking slowly, his hands in his pockets, looking around as if he was searching for something, or someone. When his eyes landed on her, he smiled and walked over. "I was hoping I'd see you here," he said, sitting down on the bench beside her. She felt a small flutter of surprise and relief. "You were?" He nodded. "I wanted to make sure you were okay. Yesterday, well, it seemed like you were going through a lot." She looked down at her hands, unsure of what to say. It was one thing to pour her heart out to a stranger, but it was another thing to have that stranger come back to check on her. "I'm better," she said finally. "Thanks to you." He shook his head. "You don't have to thank me. Sometimes, we all just need someone to listen." They fell into an easy conversation, talking about everything and nothing. He told her a little about himself, how he had moved to the city a few years ago for work, how he liked to come to the park to clear his head. She found herself laughing at his stories, something she hadn't done in a long time. As the days went by, they started meeting at the park regularly. It became their little routine, a quiet escape from the chaos of their lives. She began to look forward to these meetings, to the way he made her feel like she mattered. One evening, as they sat on the bench watching the sunset, he turned to her and said, "You know, I've been thinking. You're stronger than you realize." She raised an eyebrow, surprised. "What makes you say that?" "Because," he said, "you've been through so much, and yet you're still here. You're still fighting. That takes a lot of courage." His words struck a chord deep within her. For the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe she was stronger than she thought. Maybe she could get through this. But just as she was starting to believe in herself again, life threw her another curveball. One evening, as she was leaving work, she received a phone call that left her shaken. It was her landlord, telling her that the rent was going up, way up. She had been barely scraping by as it was, and now, she wasn't sure how she was going to make ends meet. She went to the park that night, her mind racing with worry. When she saw the stranger, she couldn't hold back the tears. She told him everything, her voice trembling as she explained her situation. He listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. When she finished, he didn't offer empty words of comfort or tell her everything would be okay. Instead, he said, "Let's figure this out together." She looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, "you're not alone in this. We'll find a way to make it work." His words filled her with a sense of gratitude she couldn't put into words. She didn't know what he meant by "we," but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had someone in her corner. Over the next few days, he helped her look for solutions. He introduced her to a friend who was looking for a roommate, which would cut her living expenses in half. He even helped her update her resume and apply for a better-paying job. She was amazed by how much he was willing to do for her, a stranger he had met in a park. When she asked him why he was going out of his way to help her, he simply smiled and said, "Because everyone deserves a chance to be happy." His kindness gave her the strength to keep going, to believe that things could get better. And slowly, they did. She moved into her new apartment, started her new job, and began to rebuild her life. But just as she was starting to find her footing, something unexpected happened. One evening, as they were sitting on their usual bench, he turned to her and said, "I have to tell you something." His tone was serious, and she felt a knot form in her stomach. "What is it?" He took a deep breath, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "I'm leaving the city," he said. "My job is transferring me to another state. I'll be gone in a week." Her heart sank. She had known this day might come, but she hadn't expected it to be so soon. She tried to smile, to act like it wasn't a big deal, but the tears in her eyes gave her away. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "You've done so much for me." He reached out and gently squeezed her hand. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "Just promise me one thing." "What?" "Promise me you'll keep going," he said. "No matter what happens, don't give up on yourself." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I promise." As they sat there in the fading light, she realized how much he had changed her life. He had shown her that even in the darkest moments, there was still hope. And even though he was leaving, she knew she would carry that hope with her, always. The week passed in a blur. She tried to focus on her new job and settling into her new apartment, but her mind kept drifting back to the stranger, her friend. She couldn't believe he was leaving. It felt like just when she had found someone who truly understood her, life was pulling him away. They met at the park every evening that week, just like they always had. But now, there was an unspoken sadness hanging over their conversations. They talked about everything, his new job, her new apartment, their favorite memories from the park. But neither of them brought up the fact that this would all be over soon. On his last evening in the city, they sat on their bench, watching the sun set one final time. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the air was filled with the sound of birds chirping and children laughing. It was a perfect evening, but it felt bittersweet. "I'm going to miss this," she said quietly, breaking the silence. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Me too." She turned to look at him, her heart aching. "I don't know what I'm going to do without you," she admitted. "You've been everything to me." He smiled softly, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "You're going to be okay," he said. "You're stronger than you think, remember?" She wanted to believe him, but the thought of facing life without him felt overwhelming. "What if I'm not?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if I can't do this on my own?" He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Listen to me," he said. "You don't have to do this on your own. You've got your new roommate, your new job, and all the strength you've built up over these past few weeks. And if you ever feel like you're falling, just remember this: reaching out for help isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of courage." His words comforted her, but they didn't take away the pain of saying goodbye. When it was time for him to leave, she stood up and hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." He hugged her back, his voice gentle. "You're going to be okay," he said again. "I believe in you." And then, just like that, he was gone. The days that followed were hard. She missed their evening talks, his calm presence, the way he always knew what to say to make her feel better. But she tried to hold on to his words, to remind herself that she was stronger than she thought. She threw herself into her work, focusing on doing her best and proving herself in her new role. Her roommate was kind and easy to live with, and they quickly became friends. Slowly but surely, she began to build a new routine, a new life. But even as she moved forward, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She thought about him often, wondering how he was doing in his new city, if he ever thought about her. She thought about reaching out to him, but she didn't want to intrude on his new life. One evening, as she was walking home from work, she passed by the park. She hadn't been there since he left. It felt too painful to go back without him. But something drew her in that night. She walked through the gates and made her way to their bench. It was empty, just like she expected. She sat down, her heart heavy with memories. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to imagine him sitting beside her, his calm voice reassuring her that everything would be okay. But when she opened her eyes, she was alone. She stayed there for a while, watching the sun set and listening to the sounds of the park. It was peaceful, but it wasn't the same. She missed him more than she had expected. As she got up to leave, she noticed something on the ground near the bench. It was a small, folded piece of paper. She picked it up and unfolded it, her heart skipping a beat when she saw his handwriting. It was a note, short and simple, but it brought tears to her eyes. I told you I believe in you. Don't forget to believe in yourself. You've got this. She didn't know when he had left the note there, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had thought of her, even after he was gone. She held the note tightly, feeling a surge of determination. He had given her so much, his time, his kindness, his belief in her. She wasn't going to let that go to waste. She walked home that night with a new sense of purpose. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure, she was going to keep going, no matter what. And maybe, just maybe, she would see him again someday. Life moved forward, as it always does. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. She settled into her new routine, finding small moments of joy in the little things, a warm cup of coffee in the morning, a kind word from a coworker, a quiet evening with her roommate. She still thought about him often, but the ache of his absence began to fade, replaced by a quiet gratitude for the time they had shared. The note he had left her became a kind of talisman. She kept it in her wallet, pulling it out whenever she felt overwhelmed or unsure. His words, "You've got this," became a mantra, a reminder that she was stronger than she thought. One Saturday morning, she decided to do something she hadn't done in a long time. She went back to the park. It was a crisp, sunny day, and the park was bustling with people. Children ran around laughing, couples strolled hand in hand, and old men sat on benches playing chess. She walked slowly, taking it all in, until she reached their bench. It was empty, just like it had been the last time she was there. She sat down, feeling a mix of emotions, nostalgia, sadness, but also a sense of peace. She closed her eyes and let the warmth of the sun wash over her, imagining him sitting beside her, his calm presence comforting her. When she opened her eyes, she noticed something unusual. A small group of people had gathered near the fountain in the center of the park. They were holding signs and passing out flyers, and she could hear snippets of their conversation. Curious, she walked over to see what was going on. As she got closer, she realized it was a community event, a fundraiser for a local shelter. The organizers were asking for donations and volunteers, and they seemed passionate about their cause. She stood there for a moment, watching them. She had never been one to get involved in things like this, but something about their energy drew her in. Before she knew it, she was walking up to one of the organizers, a friendly-looking woman with a bright smile. "Hi," she said, feeling a little nervous. "I was wondering, do you need any help?" The woman's face lit up. "Absolutely. We're always looking for volunteers. Are you interested?" She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes. I'd like to help." The woman handed her a flyer and explained what they were doing. The shelter provided food, clothing, and support for people in need, and they were trying to raise money to expand their services. It was a cause she could get behind, and she felt a spark of excitement at the idea of being part of something bigger than herself. Over the next few weeks, she threw herself into volunteering. She helped organize events, handed out flyers, and even spent a few evenings serving meals at the shelter. It was hard work, but it was also incredibly rewarding. She met new people, heard their stories, and felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. One evening, as she was helping clean up after a fundraiser, one of the other volunteers approached her. He was a tall, kind-eyed man with a warm smile, and he had been helping out at the shelter for years. "You've been doing a great job," he said. "It's nice to see someone so passionate about helping others." She smiled, feeling a little shy. "Thank you. It's been really fulfilling." He nodded. "It's not always easy, but it's worth it. You're making a difference, you know." His words stayed with her long after the event was over. She realized that, in a way, she was following in the footsteps of the stranger who had helped her. He had shown her kindness when she needed it most, and now she was doing the same for others. But even as she found joy in her new role, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She thought about him often, wondering how he was doing, if he ever thought about her. She thought about reaching out to him, but she didn't know how. One evening, as she was walking home from the shelter, she passed by the park again. She hadn't been there in a while, but something drew her in. She walked to their bench and sat down, feeling a mix of emotions. As she sat there, lost in thought, she noticed something on the ground near the bench. It was another folded piece of paper, just like the one he had left her before. Her heart raced as she picked it up and unfolded it. It was another note, written in his familiar handwriting. "I knew you'd find your way. Keep shining." She stared at the note, her mind racing. How had it gotten there? Had he come back? Was he still in the city? She looked around, half expecting to see him walking toward her, but the park was empty. She felt a mix of emotions, confusion, excitement, but also a sense of peace. She didn't know how the note had gotten there, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was still thinking of her, still believing in her. She held the note tightly, feeling a surge of determination. She wasn't going to let him down. She was going to keep going, keep helping others, keep shining, just like he had told her to. And maybe, just maybe, she would see him again someday. The second note left her with more questions than answers. She couldn't stop thinking about it. How had it ended up on the bench? Had he been there recently, or had he left it months ago, knowing she would find it eventually? The mystery gnawed at her, but there was no way to solve it. She didn't have his number, his address, or even his last name. All she had were the memories of their time together and the 2 notes he had left behind. Still, the note gave her a renewed sense of purpose. She threw herself even deeper into her volunteer work, finding solace in helping others. The shelter became a second home to her, and the people she met there, both the volunteers and those they were helping, became like a second family. She started to see the world differently, noticing the small acts of kindness that often went unnoticed. A smile from a stranger, a helping hand from a coworker, a kind word from a neighbor, these little moments began to add up, filling her life with a quiet joy she hadn't felt in years. One evening, after a long day at the shelter, she decided to take a walk through the park. It had become a kind of ritual for her, a way to clear her mind and reflect on the day. As she approached their bench, she noticed someone sitting there. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be him? But as she got closer, she realized it wasn't him. It was an older man, his face weathered but kind, and he was feeding breadcrumbs to a flock of pigeons. She hesitated for a moment, then sat down on the other end of the bench. The man glanced at her and smiled. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" She nodded, returning his smile. "It really is." They sat in silence for a while, watching the pigeons flutter around. Finally, the man spoke again. "You come here often, don't you?" She looked at him, surprised. How did you know? He chuckled. I've seen you a few times. You always sit on this bench, and you always have this look on your face. Like you're remembering something. She felt a lump form in her throat. Yeah, she said quietly. I guess I am. The man nodded, as if he understood. This bench has a way of holding memories, doesn't it? I used to come here with my wife. She's gone now, but sitting here, it's like she's still with me. She felt a surge of empathy for the man. I'm sorry for your loss, she said. He smiled sadly. Thank you. But you know, even though she's gone, I still feel her presence sometimes. Especially here. They talked for a while longer, sharing stories and memories. The man told her about his wife, how they had met in this very park decades ago, and how they had come back here every year on their anniversary. She told him about the stranger who had helped her, how he had changed her life without even realizing it. By the time they parted ways, she felt a deep sense of connection to the man. It was strange, she thought, how two strangers could share so much in such a short amount of time. But maybe that was the magic of this park, it brought people together, even if only for a moment. As she walked home that night, she thought about what the man had said. This bench has a way of holding memories. It was true. Every time she sat there, she felt a connection to the past, to the person she had been and the person she was becoming. But she also felt a connection to the future. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for sure, she was going to keep moving forward, keep helping others, keep shining. A few days later, something unexpected happened. She was at the shelter, helping serve meals, when she overheard a conversation between two volunteers. They were talking about a man who had recently started volunteering at another shelter across town. He's amazing, one of the volunteers said. He's always going out of his way to help people. And he's got this way of making you feel like everything's going to be okay. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be him? She tried to push the thought aside, telling herself it was just a coincidence. But the more she thought about it, the more she couldn't shake the feeling that it might be him. That evening, she decided to visit the other shelter. She didn't know what she would say or do if it was him, but she had to know. When she arrived, the shelter was bustling with activity. She scanned the room, her heart pounding, but she didn't see him. She was about to leave when she heard a familiar voice behind her. Can I help you? She turned around, and there he was. For a moment, they just stared at each other, neither of them sure what to say. Finally, he broke the silence. I was wondering when I'd see you again, he said, his voice soft but filled with warmth. She felt tears welling up in her eyes. I didn't know if it was really you, she said. But I had to find out. He smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through the clouds. I'm glad you did. They stood there for a moment, the world around them fading away. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure, this was just the beginning. Seeing him again felt like stepping into a dream. She had imagined this moment so many times, but now that it was happening, she didn't know what to say. He looked the same, kind eyes, calm smile, the same quiet strength that had drawn her to him in the first place. But there was something different about him too, something she couldn't quite put into words. I didn't think I'd see you again, she said finally, her voice trembling. He smiled, his eyes softening. I didn't think I'd see you either. But here we are. They stood there for a moment, the noise of the shelter fading into the background. Finally, he gestured toward a quiet corner. Do you want to sit down? Catch up? She nodded, her heart still racing. They found a small table and sat down, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. How have you been? He asked, his voice gentle. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I've been, okay. Better, actually. Thanks to you. He shook his head. You did that yourself. I just gave you a little push. She smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Maybe. But that push meant everything to me. They talked for a while, catching up on everything that had happened since they last saw each other. He told her about his new job, how it had been challenging but rewarding. She told him about her volunteer work, how it had given her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. As they talked, she realized how much she had missed him. Not just his kindness, but his presence, the way he made her feel seen, understood, valued. I found your notes, she said after a while. The ones you left on the bench. He looked surprised, then smiled. I wondered if you would. How did you know I'd go back there? She asked. He shrugged. I didn't, really. I just hoped you would. I wanted you to know that I was still thinking about you, even after I left. His words filled her with a mix of emotions, gratitude, sadness, but also a sense of hope. Thank you, she said quietly. It meant a lot to me. They sat there for a while longer, talking about everything and nothing. It felt like no time had passed, like they had picked up right where they left off. But eventually, the reality of the situation began to sink in. He was still living in another city, and she was here. They had separate lives, separate responsibilities. I don't know how this is going to work, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. We'll figure it out, he said. One step at a time. His words comforted her, but they also left her with more questions. What did this mean for them? Were they just friends, or was there something more? She didn't know, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to find out. As they parted ways that evening, she felt a mix of emotions, excitement, uncertainty, but also a deep sense of gratitude. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure, she was glad he was back in her life. Over the next few weeks, they started talking regularly. They would call each other in the evenings, sharing stories about their day, their hopes, their dreams. It felt like they were building something new, something stronger than what they had before. One evening, as they were talking on the phone, he said something that took her by surprise. I've been thinking, he said, his voice hesitant. What if I moved back to the city? I've been offered a job here, and, well, I think it's time. Her heart skipped a beat. Really? Yeah, he said. I've missed this place. Anne. I've missed you. His words filled her with a mix of emotions, excitement, fear, but also a deep sense of hope. I've missed you too, she admitted. They talked about it for a while, weighing the pros and cons, but in the end, they both knew what they wanted. A few weeks later, he moved back to the city. She helped him unpack his things, and as they stood in his new apartment, surrounded by boxes, she felt a sense of excitement she hadn't felt in years. This feels like a new beginning, she said, looking around. He smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. It is. For both of us. As they stood there, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them, she realized how far they had come. They had started as strangers, brought together by chance, but now they were something more, something she couldn't quite put into words. But she didn't need to. For now, it was enough to know that they were together, that they had found their way back to each other. And as they stood there, surrounded by the chaos of moving boxes and the promise of a new beginning, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Life began to settle into a new rhythm. With him back in the city, their connection deepened. They spent more time together, exploring the city, sharing meals, and simply enjoying each other's company. It wasn't perfect, life never is, but it felt right. They had both been through so much, and now, they were building something beautiful together. One evening, as they sat on their bench in the park, watching the sun set, he turned to her and said, "Do you remember the first time we met?" She smiled, her heart warming at the memory. Of course I do. I was sitting here, crying, and you came over to check on me. He nodded, his eyes soft with nostalgia. I didn't know what to say back then. I just knew I couldn't walk away. She reached over and took his hand, squeezing it gently. I'm glad you didn't. They sat there for a while, the silence between them comfortable and familiar. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. You've come so far since then, he said. I'm so proud of you. His words brought tears to her eyes. I couldn't have done it without you, she said. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. He shook his head. You did the hard part. I just reminded you of what you already had inside. She smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. Well, thank you for reminding me. As the days turned into weeks, their bond grew stronger. They supported each other through the ups and downs of life, celebrating the good moments and weathering the tough ones together. They became a team, two people who had found each other in the most unexpected way and were determined to make the most of it. One evening, as they were walking through the park, he stopped suddenly and turned to her. There's something I've been wanting to ask you, he said, his voice serious but filled with warmth. She looked at him, her heart skipping a beat. What is it? He took a deep breath, his eyes locked on hers. I know we've been through a lot, and I don't know what the future holds. But I do know one thing, I want to face it with you. Whatever comes our way, I want us to face it together. Her heart swelled with emotion. I want that too, she said, her voice trembling. He smiled, relief and joy shining in his eyes. Good. Because I can't imagine my life without you. They stood there for a moment, the world around them fading away. It felt like everything had led to this moment, the tears, the struggles, the moments of doubt and hope. And now, they were here, together, ready to take on whatever came next. As they walked home that evening, hand in hand, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure, they would face it together. And as they walked into the sunset, she realized that this was just the beginning of their story.